welcome to our second to last visit to the Book of Mark. And to be honest, I must say that I have a little bit of fear and trepidation speaking this morning, because the events that we're going to look at today and next week, they are the events that form everything that we believe as Christians. Everything that informs the hope that we cling to. But it's also a story that we know really well. And I don't know about you, but sometimes, because I know it so well, I can become a bit blasé. Or I can see it just in terms of these events we're going to talk about today as a necessary evil that Jesus had to go through before he was resurrected. And, Jesus, sometimes you think, he knew what he was going to have to do. Wasn't that his job? He knew that he'd had to come to die. And we become a bit blasé. We think, what difference does it make? And so my hope this morning is that we survey the Wondrous Cross. If you know that fantastic hymn, when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died. And the first verse continues like this: my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. When we look at the cross and we see ourselves in the light of it, our only response should be to be humbled before Jesus. When we see what he has done for us on the cross, our only response should be worship and humility. And as I was preparing this talk, I read this quote, and it took me a while to actually work it out in my head. This is the quote I read. What is the answer to the question, who is hanging on the cross? It is God, filled by God, with God. The Lord of the world, the author of life, the centerpiece of all reality, Jesus. We kill him and he lets us. I'll repeat that. It is God, filled by God, with God. Think of the Trinity, the three in one. It is God, filled by God, with God, the Lord of the world, the author of life, the centerpiece of all reality. We kill him and he elects us. And we could say, really, that the events of the crucifixion of Jesus splits the world. Absolutely splits the world. Paul, a few years later, says this in 1 Corinthians. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it's the power of God. The cross of Jesus, it divides opinion. Some people look at the cross and think it's foolishness. Why on earth would this man, who people say was God, who did so much good, who was hailed as a king, as the one who was going to save Israel, who seemed innocent of any wrongdoing, why would he let himself be killed in the most torturous way known to man? And why would he apparently do it willingly? And why do Christians make such a big deal of it? How on earth can the death of a man on a cross be the means by which someone has access to God? It's complete foolishness, we might say. And the disciple Peter, he might well have agreed at some point in his life. If we read, we're going to read from Mark 15 today, but if we go back a few chapters to Mark 8, verse 27, this is what he says. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. And as they were walking along, he asked them, who do people say I am? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and some say you are one of the prophets. Then he asked them, but who do you say I am? Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Well, that sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Peter puts his foot in it again. We think that he's hit the nail on the head, don't we? When Jesus says to him, "Who do you say I am?" Peter replies, "You're the Christ." Well done, Peter. Gold star for you, we might think. But look how Jesus responds. Jesus warns them not to tell anyone. Jesus is really saying, I am the Christ, but I want you to shut up about it until you learn what type of Christ I am. Because then he goes on to tell him what happened to him. Verse 31, it says, "Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead." As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples and then reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." Peter, always the one, has put his foot in it again, hasn't he? Now you can imagine the other disciples secretly quite relieved that it wasn't them who said it, that it was Peter. But to Peter, this idea of a Messiah being killed, utter foolish. Utter foolish. So the message we're going to think about today, the message of the cross, is it foolish or is it powerful? Is it foolish or is it the power of God displayed? So before we have a think about that, we're going to just remind ourselves of the events of that first Good Friday. So we're going to look at Mark chapter 15, starting at verse 21. And I'm reading from the NLT. So verse 21. "A passerby named Simon, who was from Cyrene, was coming in from the countryside just then." We've had all the events coming up to Jesus' crucifixion, and this is as Jesus is going to the cross. "And the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They offered him wine drugged with myrrh, but he refused it. Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes and threw dice to decide who would get each piece. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, 'The King of the Jews.' 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. The people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. 'Ha! Look at you now,' they yelled at him. 'You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, save yourself and come down from the cross.' The leading priests and the teachers of religious law also mocked Jesus. 'He saved others,' they scoffed, 'but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross so we can see it and believe him.' Even the men who were crucified with Jesus ridiculed him. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Then at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so he could drink. "Wait," he said, "let's see whether Elijah comes to take him down." Then Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the Roman officer who stood facing him saw how he had died, he exclaimed, "This man truly was the Son of God." Some women were there watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. They had been followers of Jesus and had cared for him while he was in Galilee. Many other women who had come with him to Jerusalem were also there. So as usual, as we've got to know in Mark states the facts, but he doesn't give us details. He states the fact, but he doesn't give us details. And he definitely does not give us details about the awfulness of crucifixion. It was the punishment that people of that time dreaded the most. The one who was supposed to be crucified was stripped naked and nailed to a cross. The nails were hammered through the wrists, and the cross then would be raised about 9 to 12 feet above the ground, and the feet nailed to the upright post. And death ultimately occurred through a combination of blood failing to circulate properly, organ failure, and asphyxiation as the body strained under its own weight. It was a manner of death that people dreaded, as it was the cruelest punishment known to man. That was what crucifixion was. And we're also left to imagine the thoughts and the feelings of the characters involved in the story, because Mark doesn't tell us, does he? How was everybody feeling during this barbaric event? We don't really know. But as we read, we get a sense that there's a story, but then there's also the story behind the story, and there's also a lot more bigger things happening behind the scenes that we are not really reading about, that we need to understand to fully appreciate the story. Because really, maybe these events aren't so foolish after all. So what we're going to do this morning, we're going to have a look at 4 things. The first thing we're going to look at is the irony of the cross. Irony means when you say something that you think isn't true, but it actually is. Right? So the irony of the cross. So the first thing we need to know is that these people around the cross thought that they were speaking words of ridicule that were actually true. If you look at verse 17 to 19, Tristan read, this was part of Tristan's talk last week. We see that in verse 17 to 19, this is like an anti-coronation. They're trying to ridicule Jesus by giving him a coronation, but it's an anti-coronation. The soldiers dress Jesus in a robe. They craft a crown of thorns on his head. They mock salute him and shout, "Hail, King of the Jews." The irony of that is that they are speaking truth in their supposed ridicule. But he's not only King of the Jews, but he is King of all creation. And they're saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," trying to take the mickey, but actually, it's true and more. Look at verse 26. They put this proclamation above the cross. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, "The King of the Jews." And John's account says that it was written in 3 languages. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And if only they had realized that this accusation of the King of the Jews was much bigger and wider than they could ever imagine. He wasn't just the King of the Jews. They were putting to death the King of the universe. And he let them. Look at the irony of verse 31. Jesus is mocked by the religious leaders. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Yeah, that's true. Jesus couldn't save himself and others simultaneously, so he chose to sacrifice himself to save others. The irony of the cross. Words meant to ridicule was actually truth. Now, is that foolish or is that powerful? So, first thing we need to think of is the irony of the cross. Things that were said to Jesus in ridicule were actually true. But the second thing we need to have a look at is the desolation of the cross. We come now to the death of Jesus. Now, verse 33 says that at noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Pitch black in the middle of the day. Now, some people have tried to explain this away by a natural phenomenon. Maybe an eclipse. The problem with it saying it was an eclipse is that a solar eclipse only produces complete darkness for a few minutes, not 3 hours. And a solar eclipse can't happen, apparently, when there's a full moon. And Jesus died at Passover, and there is always a full moon at Passover. So, it can't be an eclipse. Some people have tried to explain it away by suggesting that there was a desert windstorm that obscured the sun. So all this sand so basically whipped up, and it completely obscured the sun. The problem is with that is that Passover happens in the wet season. So the probability of a windstorm in the wet season is highly unlikely. What's more likely, or what we believe is true, is that in Scripture, darkness always represents God's displeasure and judgment. If we think about when we did Exodus, the 9th plague was darkness. Remember, there was darkness across the whole of Egypt. Remember, the Egyptian god was Ra, and he was called the sun god. Do you remember that when we did Exodus? God was producing judgment. But the 10th plague, after the darkness in Egypt, the 10th plague was Passover, where the lamb died in place of those under judgment. And its blood, remember, was spread on the doorposts of Israelite houses. So what is really, really happening as the sun is blotted out, as we've got 3 hours of darkness right in the middle of the day? We think this is what is happening. If we come to verse 34, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, theologians have long debated why Jesus would use these words, which are a quote from Psalm 22. Some suggest that Jesus was angry, he was defiant, he lost his faith at that moment on the cross. Really? Jesus' faith failed him then? Really? I don't think so. Some suggest it was a cry of loneliness. Jesus felt forsaken even though he wasn't. Some even suggest that it was a shout of victory because Psalm 22, towards the end of Psalm 22, it ends in a victorious way. And really, Jesus just didn't get to the end of the psalm while he was shouting out on the cross. Or could it be that this was a cry of real desolation? In the darkness, think about this. In the darkness, Jesus, for the first time ever from eternity, is utterly alone. There is actual separation between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for the first time ever. Remember, Jesus pre-existed before he came to Bethlehem. Could it be that there is actual separation between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for the first time, but voluntarily accepted by each of them due to the gravity of our sin? For the first time in eternity, the Godhead feels fractured. You see, my God, why have you forsaken me, is the language of intimacy. And biblically, it's how you address someone who you have a close relationship with. So when Jesus cries out, "Why have you, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He is experiencing the desolation of separation from the one from whom, from eternity, he has known utter unity, infinite, perfect love. Now, we cannot ever imagine utter, infinite, imperfect love. We are human beings. We cannot imagine that. But it's not just Jesus as the Son who experiences this loss. The whole of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, are willing to experience this utter desolation of the separation in order to save us, to give us life. Because of how much we are loved by the Godhead. Now that is mind-blowing stuff, isn't it? The longer and deeper the love, the greater the torment of its loss. Jesus, the maker and master of the world, was being unmade. And in the darkness, Jesus was experiencing what should have been our judgment day. Jesus lived the life we should have lived but couldn't due to our sin. And he died the death we should have died because of our sin. Perfect obedience by God the Son on our behalf. What a Saviour. So the desolation of the cross, is it foolish or is it powerful? The desolation of the cross. The Trinity, infinite, perfect unity and love from eternity, and Jesus faces that desolation for us. So we've surveyed the wonder of the irony of the cross and the desolation of the cross, but now we're going to consider the triumph of the cross. And in verse 37, Mark tells us that Jesus uttered a loud cry and then breathed his last. Now, we have to go to another gospel writer to find out what he actually said. And John tells us that Jesus shouts, "It is finished." And in Greek, if you know a bit about grammar, the word used is tetelestai, which is in the perfect tense. But what it means is, Jesus is saying, it has been and will forever remain finished. It has been and will forever remain finished. But what is finished? And as Jesus dies, the action passes to the other side of Jerusalem. And when I was researching this, the writer described the temple as an interactive multimedia aid, right? Multimedia teaching aid. Now, we looked at the temple when we did Exodus, didn't we? And if you remember, the temple was designed as a model of heaven and earth in order to dramatize how sinners can be acceptable to a holy God. Now, if you remember, when we studied Exodus, an Israelite, what they would have to do would bring their sacrifice to the priest who would stand at the altar. The sinner would lay their hand on the head of the animal sacrifice and confess their sin as a depiction of their sin being transferred to the animal. The animal is then killed. An innocent animal dies in the place of their guilty owner. Now, once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest goes into the most holy place, and there was this huge curtain separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the place where God's presence dwelt. Why the curtain? It was as if to say, God saying, keep out because it's not safe for you to enter. It's not God being standoffish. It's not God saying, oh, I want a bit of privacy. It's not safe for you to enter. My holiness, because of my holiness, it's not safe for you to enter. My holiness could destroy you. But at the moment Jesus dies, the curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. So what is God proclaiming at this moment? Jesus is the true sacrifice. He is the Lamb who was slain. It's all over Hebrews. He is the Lamb who is slain. Jesus is the true priest who brings us to God. Jesus is the true temple. He is the meeting place of God and man. It's all about Jesus. It's all about him. When God created the world, his desire was to live in complete harmony with his creation. But then humankind wanted their own way. They didn't want to live under God's rule, and this rebellion created a barrier between man and God. But when Jesus died, the barrier between man and God was removed. Eden is restored. Now we can have full access to a holy God without judgment because Jesus has become our sin offering. It's as though Jesus jumps onto the altar in the temple and sacrifices himself. That's how the Jews would look at it. The only one entitled to judge takes that judgment on himself. And we let him. Ponder that truth. The only one entitled to judge takes that judgment on himself. But I think Jesus cries out these words for other reasons too. And if we're not careful, we can just diminish what Christ did on the cross, what theologians call the atonement, to just being about me and us and God. We can narrow the atonement down. It was all just about me and God, or us and God. But there are so many aspects of the atonement that we need to put all of them together like a big jigsaw or a big Lego building in order to get the full picture. And there's too many aspects to discuss here. And what I'll do, I'll put a link in the Preach devotional this week of a really good website that shows you all the aspects of the atonement. If you're interested, you can have a look. But there's one aspect that we're going to look at which I think might further explain it is finished. And theologians call this aspect of the atonement Christus Victor, Christ victorious. When Jesus died, he defeated the powers of evil such as sin, death, and the devil in order to free mankind from their bondage. This is how Paul describes it in Colossians 2, 14 and 15. He, meaning Jesus, cancelled the record of the charges against us and took it away by nailing it to the cross. In this way, he disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. He shamed them publicly by his victory over them on the cross. Our sin is nailed to the cross. Our charge sheet of sin is cancelled at the cross. But more than that, Jesus triumphed over the spiritual rulers and authorities, anything that stands in rebellion to God. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross appeared that he is lost, but in reality declared victory. Triumph of the cross. Is it foolish or is it powerful? So, the last thing we're going to look at today is the witness of the cross. Who is the first person to grasp, even in part, what has just happened? How significant it's a Roman Gentile was the first person to truly see who Jesus was. If we read verse 39, it says this: when the Roman officer who stood facing him saw how he had died, he exclaimed, "This man truly was the Son of God." Now, what do we know about this man? The scripture tells us nothing about him apart from that he was a centurion. So, but we do know something about centurions in general. They were enlisted soldiers who had risen through the ranks of the Roman army, and they were hard, brutal men. You know, they weren't like officers in the First World War who were quite posh. They were hard, brutal men. They witnessed death and perpetrated death on a regular basis. In fact, the commentaries that I read suggest that this man, the Roman centurion, would actually be the one who would nail the nails through Jesus' wrists. So there must have been something about the death of Jesus that was so unique that caused this man to declare this man truly was the Son of God. The disciples hadn't grasped it because although they recognized Jesus as Messiah, it didn't necessarily have to match that Jesus also could be divine. The two, Messiah and God, they didn't automatically have to match like we would think. Because in their understanding, God couldn't die. So how could Jesus both be God and die? They just couldn't understand it. But this hard Roman killing machine, he gets it. And we don't really realise the gravity of the statement that he made, because every Roman coin was inscribed with this inscription: Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. And the only person a loyal Roman would ever call the Son of God was Caesar. So, what is this centurion? He is declaring that he has switched allegiance. He switched allegiance from Caesar, and he's given the title, the accolade of Son of God to this man who has just died an horrific death that this soldier has witnessed many times. This man truly was the Son of God. The beauty of Jesus flooded the darkness of this centurion's life with light. Foolish? Or was it powerful? So, what can we conclude? What can we take away? What's our takeaway from the irony, the desolation, the triumph, and the witness of the cross? Firstly, and we don't really want to think about this, but firstly, our sin must be extremely horrible. Often, we look at ourselves and we do a bit of self-comparison, don't we? Well, I'm really not that bad, am I? And I'm definitely not as bad as whoever. But when we see ourselves in the light of Jesus' perfect life and death, we need to get a reality check. We need to humble ourselves. If there was no other way that God could forgive our unrighteousness except that he should bear it himself, then our sin, our rebellion against God, our constant desire to be our own God, with a little g, must be serious indeed. But the flip side of that is that God's love must be wonderful beyond comprehension. God could have abandoned us to our own fate, but the Father, Son, and Spirit, together in the Trinity, collectively emptied themselves. They voluntarily experienced the pain of utter desolation in order to bring us back to God. Those of us who have rejected him, those of us who have decided to go their own way, they emptied themselves, experiencing the pain of utter desolation to bring us back to God. But also, the salvation that Christ purchased for us came at the ultimate price, his own blood. There is no good deed, no religious observance, nothing we can do to contribute to that. And all we can do is give ourselves to him in love and adoration and worship. That's all we can do. We can't add to what he has done on the cross. So the hymn I started with at the beginning, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, the last line is this: love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. So this morning, let's survey this wondrous cross. Let's see the Father, Son and Spirit tearing themselves apart because of their great love for us. Jesus, the Son, who from eternity had experienced love and unity and togetherness with the Godhead that we cannot comprehend, willingly being killed in the most shameful way imaginable because of his great love for us. When we truly see that, it melts our hardness, it shatters our darkness, and it gives us a distaste for anything that can dominate us and turn us away from God. Christ's darkness can dispel and destroy our own darkness so we can live in the experience of the tenderness, light, and life of Christ. So, the cross, in its irony, its desolation, its triumph, its witness, is it foolish or is it powerful? We're just going to have a few moments as we ponder the cross, a few moments of silence for you to just speak to God about what you've heard this morning. Another hymn that's been on my mind this week. Here is love, vast as the ocean, loving kindness as the flood, when the Prince of Peace, our ransom, shed for us his precious blood. Who his love will not remember, who can cease to sing his praise? He will never be forgotten throughout heaven's eternal days. On the Mount of Crucifixion, fountains opened deep and wide. Through the floodgates of God's mercy flowed a vast and gracious tide. Grace and love like mighty rivers poured incessant from above, and heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed a guilty world in love. Jesus, we are in awe of you this morning, that you should experience the desolation of the cross because of your great love for us. And our only response can be love so amazing, so divine, demands our life, our soul, our all. We just want to praise you this morning, Lord Jesus. Amen.